close your eyes for a moment and imagine this with me. You're floating on the surface of the ocean at night, stars scattered above you like diamond dust on black velvet, and beneath your body, stretching down into darkness so complete it seems to swallow light itself, is a world more alien than the surface of Mars. A world where the pressure would crush a human body in seconds, where creatures glow with their own cold fire, where mountains taller than Everest rise from plains we've barely explored, where the rules of life, as we understand them, bend and twist into something almost unrecognizable. This is the deep ocean. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, I'm going to take you there, not just to learn facts, but to feel the profound mystery of what lies beneath. I've spent years studying the ocean, but more than that, I've spent countless nights lying awake, thinking about what it means that 70% of our planet is covered by water, and we've explored less than 5% of it. Think about that. We've sent rovers to Mars, we've photographed distant galaxies, we've split atoms and mapped the human genome. But the world beneath the waves, the world that covers most of our home, remains largely unknown to us. There's something deeply humbling about that, something that puts our human concerns into perspective. Tonight isn't just about facts, though I'll share 200 of them with you as you drift towards sleep. Tonight is about reconnecting with wonder. It's about remembering that mystery still exists in our world, that there are frontiers not in distant space, but right here, right beneath the surface of the water that makes up most of our blue planet. And as I share these facts with you, each one carefully chosen, each one a small window into an alien world, I want you to let them wash over you like waves. Don't try to remember them all. Don't test yourself. Just float on the tide of curiosity and let it carry you gently toward rest. The deep ocean begins where sunlight ends. Scientists call this the twilight zone, and it starts around 200 meters below the surface. But we're going deeper tonight, much deeper, down to places where the pressure is so intense it would be like having 50 jumbo jets stacked on top of your body. Down to the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, the ancient Greek underworld, where the deepest trenches carve into the Earth's crust like scars. Down to where life shouldn't exist, but does anyway, thriving in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about the requirements for survival. Let me start with something that changed how I see everything. The ocean produces more than half of the oxygen you're breathing right now. Not the rainforests, though they're crucial too. The ocean, tiny organisms called phytoplankton, so small you'd need a microscope to see them, photosynthesizing in vast numbers, creating the air that fills your lungs. Every other breath you take is a gift from the sea. You are connected to the deep ocean right now, in this moment, by something as intimate as your breath. The deepest point we know of is the Challenger Deep, in the Mariana Trench. It's nearly 11,000 meters down, almost 7 miles beneath the waves. If you dropped Mount Everest into it, the peak would still be over a mile underwater. When filmmaker James Cameron descended there in 2012, he was the first human to visit in over 50 years. He described it as a desolate, lunar landscape. But even there, even in that crushing darkness, he saw life. Small amphipods, shrimp-like creatures, thriving in conditions that would annihilate us instantly. Here's what moves me about that. Life doesn't just survive in the deep ocean. It finds a way to flourish. It adapts. It creates beauty in the dark. And there's something we can learn from that. Something that goes beyond marine biology and touches on how we live our own lives. When pressure increases, when darkness seems complete, when we're in the deepest trenches of our own experience, life still finds a way, not despite the darkness, but sometimes because of it. The deep ocean is home to the largest migration on Earth, and it happens every single day. It's called the diel vertical migration. As the sun sets, billions upon billions of creatures, from tiny zooplankton to larger fish and squid, rise from the depths toward the surface to feed. As dawn approaches, they descend again, seeking the safety of darkness. This migration involves more biomass than any other daily movement of life on Earth. An entire world rising and falling with the light, a rhythm that's been maintained for millions of years, invisible to most of us on land. The ocean floor itself holds mysteries that challenge our understanding of what life needs to survive. In 1977, scientists descended to the depths near the Galapagos Islands and discovered something that rewrote biology textbooks. Hydrothermal vents, chimneys of superheated water erupting from cracks in the Earth's crust, surrounded by thriving ecosystems in total darkness. These vents spew water heated to temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit, laden with minerals and chemicals. The pressure at these depths would crush a human instantly. No sunlight has reached here in millions of years. By every rule we thought we knew, nothing should live here. Yet these vents are surrounded by life in astonishing abundance. Giant tube worms, some reaching 8 feet in length, cluster around the vents in crimson gardens. They have no mouth, no digestive system, no way to eat in any conventional sense. Instead, they host bacteria within their bodies. Bacteria that feed on the chemicals in the vent water and produce energy through chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. The worms and bacteria exist in perfect symbiosis, each unable to survive without the other. White crabs scuttle across the volcanic rock, blind fish navigate by sensing chemical gradients, and fields of mussels coat every surface. These ecosystems don't depend on the sun. They run on Earth's internal heat, powered by the same geological forces that move continents and build mountains. Life found a way to tap into an entirely different energy source, to build complexity in absolute darkness. The discovery changed everything we thought about where life could exist. If life thrives at hydrothermal vents here, perhaps it could exist in the dark oceans beneath the ice of Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. Perhaps in the underground seas of Enceladus, orbiting Saturn, the requirements for life suddenly seemed less restrictive than we'd imagined. These vent communities are also ancient beyond measure. The bacteria that power these ecosystems are among the oldest forms of life on Earth. Some scientists believe that life itself may have originated at hydrothermal vents, that the first living cells emerged from the chemistry of superheated water meeting cold ocean in darkness. If that's true, then every living thing on this planet, the trees outside your window, the dog sleeping at your feet, you yourself may trace its ancestry back to these lightless depths. We may all be children of the abyss. It's a humbling thought. We spend so much time looking up at the stars, at the sky, searching for meaning in the vastness above. But perhaps we should have been looking down all along. Perhaps home was always in the darkness, in the crushing depths where water meets stone and energy flows from the earth itself. And here's what makes it even more profound. These vents don't last forever. The geological processes that create them eventually shut them down. A vent community might thrive for decades or centuries, and then one day the flow of chemicals simply stops. The water goes cold, the bacteria die, and everything that depended on them, the tube worms, the crabs, the fish, must disperse into the surrounding darkness or perish. But life finds a way. Vent larvae can drift on deep ocean currents for months, traveling hundreds of miles through absolute darkness, somehow finding their way to new vents, new sources of chemical energy. It's navigation without sight, without landmarks, without anything we would recognize as a map. How do they do it? We don't fully know, but they do it. Generation after generation, they do it. These creatures live on borrowed time in temporary oases, yet they persist. They remind us that impermanence isn't the opposite of meaning sometimes, it's the source of it. Nothing about these ecosystems is guaranteed. Everything is contingent, fragile, sustained by forces beyond their control. And yet they thrive with an intensity that puts our own anxieties to shame. You might be feeling that same fragility in your own life. That sense that everything you've built could shift without warning, that the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you'd like to believe. But here's what the desert teaches what those beetles know in their exoskeletons, and what the cacti understand in their spines. Fragility isn't weakness. It's awareness. It's the honest recognition that survival requires adaptation, not the illusion of invincibility. The brittle bush that grows throughout the Sonoran doesn't pretend to be immune to drought. When water becomes scarce, it drops its leaves, completely. It stands there, seemingly dead, branches bare against the sky. To an untrained eye, it looks like failure, like giving up, but it's doing the opposite. It's concentrating its resources, protecting its core, waiting. And when the rain returns, whether that's weeks or months later, it erupts with new growth, bright yellow flowers that seem impossibly cheerful for a plant that just looked like firewood. That's not fragility as we usually define it. That's strategic vulnerability. The willingness to let go of what you can't sustain in order to preserve what matters most. We're not very good at that, are we? We tend to cling to everything, relationships that drain us, jobs that diminish us, versions of ourselves that stopped fitting years ago. We hold on until our hands cramp, terrified that letting go means losing, when sometimes it's the only way to survive the season we're in. The desert creatures understand something we've forgotten in our climate-controlled lives. You can't control the environment. You can only control your response to it. The kangaroo rat doesn't waste energy cursing the heat. The roadrunner doesn't petition for more rainfall. They work within reality, not against it. And there's a strange freedom in that acceptance. When you stop demanding that the world be other than it is, when you stop insisting that you should be immune to difficulty, something shifts. Not into resignation, that's different. Resignation is passive, defeated. What I'm talking about is active engagement with what's actually true. The saguaro doesn't resent the sun. It has evolved to need exactly that intensity. Those accordion pleats in its trunk, they expand when water is available and contract during drought. The whole cactus literally changing shape in response to circumstances. Flexible architecture, adaptable form. The accordion pleats of the saguaro living geometry that breathes with the seasons. We built cities with rigid grids and wonder why they fail when conditions change. Meanwhile, a desert plant has been practicing responsive architecture for millions of years. And perhaps most remarkable, the saguaro's relationship with time itself. These cacti grow so slowly that the distinction between individual and species begins to blur. A saguaro that's 200 years old might have germinated when your great-great-great-great-grandparents were alive. It was a seedling during wars you've read about in history books. It developed its first arm while steam engines were still novel. This creates something strange, a form of vegetative memory. The trunk of an old saguaro contains the climate record of centuries. Good years show as wider growth rings. Drought years compress into thin lines. Fire scars remain visible decades later. Frost damage from a particularly harsh winter in 1937 can still be seen in the wood grain of cacti standing today. They're living archives, historical documents written in cellulose and water, and they remember in other ways too. When a saguaro is damaged, say a branch is lost to wind or lightning, the cactus doesn't just heal, it reorganizes its entire internal structure. Water channels reroute, the ribs redistribute structural support. The plant literally rewrites its anatomy around the injury. It's not healing that returns the organism to its previous state. It's transformation that creates a new functional equilibrium. The wound becomes part of the architecture. This is adaptation at its most profound, not resistance to change, but incorporation of it. The saguaro doesn't fight its history. It builds with it. Every scar becomes structure. Every loss informs the pattern of future growth. We could learn something from that. We spend so much energy trying to return to who we were before difficult events. The saguaro teaches a different lesson. Become who you need to be because of them. There's a Japanese art form called kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold. When a bowl shatters, instead of hiding the cracks or throwing the piece away, artisans fill the breaks with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The repaired bowl isn't disguised to look undamaged. The golden seams are highlighted, celebrated. The bowl becomes more valuable because it broke. The philosophy behind kintsugi is that breakage and repair are part of an object's history, not something to hide. The flaws make it unique. The damage makes it beautiful. We don't often extend that same grace to ourselves. When something breaks us, a loss, a failure, a betrayal, we work so hard to cover the cracks. We pretend we're fine. We rush to appear whole again. We're terrified someone will see where we split apart. But what if we treated our own breaks the way kintsugi treats a shattered bowl? What if we filled our cracks with something that catches the light? What if the very places we broke became the most interesting parts of who we are? I'm not saying we should glorify pain. I'm not suggesting suffering is noble or that we should seek it out. But when it comes, and it will come, maybe we can let it change the shape of us without believing it's ruined us. The woman who lost her business and learned she was more than her work. The man whose body stopped cooperating and discovered patience he never knew he had. The teenager whose friend group fell apart and found out she could build better ones. These aren't stories about people who went back to normal. They're stories about people who let themselves become something different, something that wouldn't have existed without the break. And maybe that's what we miss when we're in the middle of it all. When everything's falling apart and we're desperately trying to hold the pieces together, we can't see that some pieces aren't meant to fit back into the old picture. I remember talking to someone who lost everything in a flood. Not figuratively, literally. The water came through their town and took houses, belongings, entire neighborhoods. She told me that in the immediate aftermath, all she could think about was reconstruction, getting back what was lost, rebuilding exactly what had been there before. But as weeks turned into months, something shifted. She started questioning why she'd lived where she lived, worked where she worked, filled her home with things she rarely used. The flood had made those decisions for her, and in the empty space that remained, she could finally ask, "What do I actually want?" She moved to a different state, started a completely different career, built a life that looked nothing like the one the water had taken. And when people asked if she wished the flood had never happened, her answer surprised them. She said she wouldn't choose to go through it again, but she also wouldn't give up who she'd become because of it. That's the paradox we rarely talk about. The worst thing that ever happened to you might also be the door to the best thing that ever happened to you. Not because suffering is noble or necessary, but because crisis breaks open possibilities that comfort keeps sealed shut. Think about the relationships in your life right now. How many of them would exist without some breaking point, yours or theirs? The friend you got close to after your divorce because she'd been through one too. The mentor who took you under their wing because your struggle reminded them of their own. The partner you met only because the previous relationship ended and sent you down a completely different path. We connect most deeply at the broken places. That's not poetry, it's pattern. The people who've survived their own versions of falling apart recognize something in you when you're going through yours. There's a frequency that only plays at that particular depth. And maybe that's what we're really afraid of when we resist falling apart, not the pain itself, but the translation we'll become. We're afraid that if we go down there, we'll come back speaking a language no one wants to hear. We're afraid we'll lose our place at tables where everyone's still pretending, still performing, still keeping their catastrophes tastefully hidden behind competent smiles. There's this moment I remember, sitting in a bright cafe full of people talking about normal things, weekend plans, work projects, the best place to get your car serviced. And I'm sitting there, 3 weeks after my life imploded, ordering coffee like a functional human, but inside I'm thinking, I have traveled to a country none of you have visas for. I have seen things about existence that can't be unseen, and now I have to pretend that whether I want oat milk or regular milk is a question that carries weight. That dissonance is brutal. You become bilingual, fluent in both the language of ordinary life and the language of collapse, and you can't always tell people which one you're speaking. You learn to translate yourself in real time, to downgrade your truth to fit the conversation's bandwidth. But here's what no one tells you about that bilingualism. It becomes a gift, eventually. Not right away, it just feels like exile. But slowly, you realize you can move between worlds. You can sit with someone at their worst and not flinch, not try to fix, not offer toxic positivity, because you remember what you actually needed when you were there. You needed someone who could sit in the dark without turning on all the lights and pretending it was daytime. You become a translator for other people's pain. They tell you things they can't tell others, because somehow they sense you have the vocabulary. You've done the immersion program. You've lived in that country long enough to know its customs. And here's what nobody warns you about. Once you become fluent in crisis, people start to resent you for it. Not openly, not with words, but you'll feel it in the subtle shifts. The way someone's face changes when you instinctively know what to do in an emergency while they're still frozen. The slight edge in their voice when they say, "You're so calm about everything," like it's an accusation, not a compliment. Because your competence reminds them of their panic. Your steadiness highlights their shakiness. And instead of admiring the skill you never wanted to develop, they feel diminished by it. I've watched this happen over and over. The friend who gets irritated when you handle a medical emergency efficiently. The family member who makes snide comments about you being so good in a crisis, with a tone that suggests you're somehow showing off. The colleague who interprets your ability to stay focused during chaos as emotional coldness. They don't understand that you're not calm because you're better than them. You're calm because you've been forced to build that capacity through repetition and survival. You're functional because non-functionality wasn't an option when you were 12 or 15 or 22. But they see your capability and feel their own inadequacy. And that discomfort gets projected back onto you as resentment, judgment, or dismissal. The cruelest part? You start to hide your competence. You learn to pretend things are harder than they are. You fake a little panic so others feel less uncomfortable around you. You deliberately fumble or hesitate before acting, creating a performance of uncertainty you don't actually feel, just so you don't make anyone else feel small. You become fluent in crisis, and then spend energy pretending you're still a beginner, just to keep the peace. And this, too, is exhausting. This constant translation between what you know how to do and what you're allowed to show you know how to do. This performance of being less capable than you are so others can feel more capable than they are. You learn to read rooms before you enter them. You learn the subtle calculus of who can handle your competence and who will be threatened by it. You develop this strange sixth sense about when to speak up and when to stay quiet, when your contribution will be welcomed, and when it will be perceived as showing off, overstepping, not knowing your place. And here's what's truly exhausting about this. The mental load isn't just about doing the work. It's about constantly managing other people's feelings about you doing the work. You're not just solving the problem. You're solving the problem while making sure no one feels bad that you're solving the problem. You're not just being competent. You're being competent while reassuring everyone that your competence doesn't diminish theirs. It's like running a race while also carrying the emotional luggage of everyone you're racing against. And nobody talks about this particular kind of fatigue. The bone-deep tiredness that comes from never being able to just do your job without also managing the social and emotional dynamics around doing your job. Men talk about imposter syndrome too. Absolutely. But there's a difference between feeling like you might not belong and being constantly reminded, in 1,000 subtle ways, that you're a guest in a space that wasn't designed for you. Women don't just doubt themselves. They're given evidence, repeatedly, that their doubt is justified, that their presence is provisional, that their competence is always up for debate. You walk into a meeting and someone assumes you're the note-taker. You make a suggestion and it's ignored. Then 5 minutes later, a man says the exact same thing and suddenly it's brilliant. You're interrupted constantly, spoken over, explained to about things you literally have a degree in. These moments aren't isolated incidents. They're death by 1,000 paper cuts. And the worst part? You start to internalize it. You start to wonder if maybe you really aren't as competent as you thought. Maybe your ideas genuinely aren't as good. Maybe you do need things explained to you, even though you've been working in this field for years. This is what psychologists call gaslighting on a systemic level. It's not one abusive partner telling you you're crazy. It's an entire culture, repeatedly and consistently, sending you the message that your perception of reality is wrong, that the bias you're experiencing isn't real, that you're being too sensitive, too emotional, reading too much into things. And here's where it gets truly insidious. Because you're intelligent, you start to question yourself. You think, maybe I am being paranoid. Maybe I am seeing patterns that aren't there. You perform mental gymnastics to explain away each incident. That time you were interrupted? Well, maybe you weren't being clear enough. That time your idea was credited to someone else. Maybe you didn't present it forcefully enough. That assumption, you're the assistant. Maybe you should dress more authoritatively. You bend yourself into increasingly impossible shapes, trying to fix a problem that isn't actually yours to fix. You modulate your tone, your appearance, your body language. You become hyper-aware of every word you say, every email you send. You add exclamation points, so you don't seem too harsh, then immediately worry you seem too bubbly and unprofessional. You state your qualifications up front so people take you seriously, then worry you sound arrogant and unlikable. It's exhausting. It's a constant mental load that your male colleagues simply don't carry. They get to just exist, to be neutral, to have a bad day without someone attributing it to their gender, to speak directly without being called aggressive, to be ambitious without being called pushy. And the really maddening thing? When you try to talk about it, you're often met with dismissal or defensiveness. You're told you're being too sensitive, that you're imagining things, that times have changed and these problems don't really exist anymore. Which, let's be honest, is just another form of gaslighting, because the data tells a very different story. Women still earn less than men for the same work. They're still underrepresented in leadership positions across almost every industry. They're still doing the majority of unpaid domestic labor, even when they work full-time jobs. These aren't opinions. These are measurable facts. But here's where it gets even more exhausting, because we're not just fighting against obvious discrimination anymore. That would almost be easier to address. What we're up against now is something more subtle, more insidious. It's the death by 1,000 cuts. The micro-inequities that individually seem too small to mention but collectively create an entirely different experience of the world. It's being interrupted in meetings so often that you stop finishing your sentences. It's watching your ideas get ignored until a male colleague repeats them 5 minutes later and gets credit. It's the performance review that describes you as abrasive for behavior that would be called leadership in a man. It's being asked in job interviews about your plans for children, while your male counterparts face no such questions. It's the constant, exhausting calculation. How much can I assert myself before I'm seen as difficult? How competent can I appear before I'm seen as threatening? How much success can I achieve before I'm punished for it? And let's talk about that last one, because there's actually research on this. It's called the backlash effect. Studies show that successful women face social and professional penalties that successful men simply don't encounter. Women who negotiate for higher salaries are viewed more negatively than men who do the same thing. Women who display confidence are often seen as arrogant, while confident men are seen as capable. It's a rigged game where the rules change depending on your gender. And here's the most exhausting part. Women are expected to navigate this rigged game perfectly. They're supposed to be assertive, but not too assertive. Confident, but not threatening. Ambitious, but still likable. It's like being asked to walk a tightrope while someone keeps moving the rope. Men don't face these impossible standards. A man can be direct in a meeting, and he's seen as decisive. A woman is direct and she's difficult. A man can advocate for himself and he's go-getting. A woman does it and she's pushy. The same behavior gets filtered through completely different lenses depending on gender. This double bind shows up in performance reviews in ways that are almost comical if they weren't so damaging. Studies analyzing thousands of performance reviews found that women receive vague, personality-focused feedback, while men receive specific, achievement-focused feedback. Women are told they need to work on their communication style or be more of a team player. Men are told they need to develop specific technical skills or take on particular projects. Even more revealing, women are far more likely to receive critical feedback that's subjective and personality-based. Words like abrasive, strident, emotional, and irrational appear almost exclusively in women's reviews. Men rarely face criticism about their interpersonal style unless it's truly extreme. And when men do receive critical feedback, it's usually framed constructively, here's what you need to develop, rather than as a character flaw. This matters because vague feedback doesn't help anyone improve, but it does create a perfect system for justifying why women aren't promoted. You can't point to concrete failures, but you can gesture vaguely at fit, or leadership presence, or executive presence, that mysterious quality that somehow men seem to naturally possess, and women perpetually lack. The executive presence concept is particularly insidious. When you dig into what people mean by it, it often boils down to acts like the men who are already executives. Tall helps. A deep voice helps. Confidence that borders on arrogance helps, but only if you're male. Women with the same traits? They're labeled aggressive, shrill, or difficult. It's exhausting, isn't it? The double bind. Be assertive, but not too assertive. Be confident, but not threatening. Lead, but don't forget to smile. And here's the thing that makes this all so insidious. These stereotypes don't just live in the minds of sexist old men in corner offices. They're in all of us. Studies show that both men and women rate identical behavior differently depending on the gender of the person displaying it. A man who negotiates hard is a strong leader. A woman doing the exact same thing is pushy. A man who speaks directly is clear and decisive. A woman doing it is abrasive. This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now, in modern workplaces, in companies with diversity statements and unconscious bias training. Because knowing about bias and actually overcoming it, those are two very different things. Let's talk about another brutal mechanism, the maternal wall. You'd think in 2024 we'd be past this, but the data tells a different story. When a woman becomes a mother or even just gets married, sometimes she suddenly becomes less committed in the eyes of her employer, less serious, less available. Her competence ratings often drop. She gets passed over for promotions because people assume she won't want the travel, the hours, the responsibility. Meanwhile, men who become fathers often see a boost. The fatherhood bonus is real and measurable. Fathers are seen as more stable, more responsible, more committed. They're family men now. They need to provide, so they get raises, promotions, opportunities. Same life event, opposite career consequences, just depends on your chromosome configuration. And if you're a woman who doesn't have children, don't think you escape. Then you're cold, unnatural, probably too focused on your career, can't win. The research on this is stark. Women with children earn less than women without children, who earn less than men without children, who earn less than men with children. Parenthood is a career penalty for women and a career advantage for men. How's that for family values? The family, we're told, is sacred, the cornerstone of society, the bedrock of civilization. And yet we've structured our entire economic system to punish the people who actually do the work of creating and maintaining families. We've made it financially ruinous to care for others. We've turned the most fundamental human bonds into luxury goods that only the wealthy can afford without sacrifice. Consider the math of modern parenthood. Childcare costs more than college tuition in 33 states. The average family spends over $12,000 a year per child on care. That's more than the average annual cost of in-state public college. We've decided that watching a toddler should cost more than educating an adult. Make it make sense. And here's the beautiful irony. We pay childcare workers poverty wages while charging parents premium prices. The median childcare worker makes about $28,000 a year. They can't afford to put their own children in the centers where they work. So where does all that money go? Overhead, regulation, compliance, insurance, real estate. The system is so inefficient that it simultaneously exploits workers and bankrupts families, and still barely anyone makes money except landlords and insurance companies. But sure, let's keep talking about how the real problem is that women just aren't leaning in hard enough. Let's keep pretending this is about individual choices rather than systemic design. Let's keep acting like mothers are failing when actually the economy is failing mothers. The phrase work-life balance is itself a confession. It admits that work and life are opposed to each other, that living and laboring are separate, incompatible activities, that you must balance them carefully because having too much of one means having too little of the other. What a bleak way to describe human existence. And who bears the burden of this balancing act? Not corporations, not governments, individual people, mostly women. We've privatized the problem of combining care work with paid work, made it each family's individual puzzle to solve. Some solve it with money. Most solve it with sleep deprivation, stress, and the quiet abandonment of their own needs. And here's the truly twisted part. We call this choice. We tell women they can choose to lean in or lean out, choose to prioritize career or family, choose to be fulfilled by professional achievement or domestic satisfaction, as if these were equivalent options on a menu. As if the structural constraints weren't already determining which items most women can afford to order. The language of choice obscures the architecture of constraint. When childcare costs more than rent, that's not choice. When parental leave doesn't exist or isn't paid, that's not choice. When workplace cultures penalize any acknowledgement of caregiving responsibilities, that's not choice. When schools operate on schedules designed for families with full-time homemakers, that's not choice. Real choice requires real options, and real options require resources, support, and structural accommodation. But we've individualized what is fundamentally a collective problem. We've made family formation an act of personal resourcefulness rather than a shared social project. And then we wonder why people are choosing not to participate. Here's what nobody talks about. Declining birth rates aren't a failure of individual values or priorities. They're a rational response to impossible conditions. Young people today aren't rejecting parenthood because they're selfish or career-obsessed or addicted to avocado toast. They're looking at the actual reality of raising children in this economy, with these support systems, under these conditions, and they're doing the math. And the math doesn't work. You need 2 incomes to afford housing, but childcare consumes 1 entire income. Healthcare is tied to employment, so you can't risk leaving your job. Student debt payments continue regardless of your family status. Housing costs keep rising. Wages remain stagnant. And somehow, in the midst of all this, you're supposed to provide emotional attunement, educational enrichment, and constant engaged presence. The economics of parenthood have become fundamentally untenable for anyone without significant family wealth or support. And yet the conversation around declining birth rates focuses on everything except these material realities. We talk about cultural values, shifting priorities, the rise of individualism, as if wanting basic economic security before having children is some kind of moral failure rather than elementary prudence. And yet the dominant narrative keeps circling back to personal choice, as if millions of individuals across dozens of countries all simultaneously decided, independently, to reorganize their life priorities in exactly the same direction. What are the odds? It's like saying that when 1,000 birds suddenly change direction mid-flight, each one just happened to feel like going left at that exact moment. We recognize murmurations as collective responses to shared environmental pressures, but when it comes to human reproductive behavior, we insist on treating it as a million isolated personal decisions. The fertility panic crowd loves to frame declining birth rates as a crisis of values, a spiritual emptiness, a loss of meaning. They'll point to surveys showing that people want more children than they actually have, and present this as evidence of some deep cultural malaise. But pause on that for a moment. What they're actually documenting is a gap between desire and possibility, between what people want in an ideal world and what they can reasonably manage in the world that actually exists. It's the same logic that would survey people about their dream homes and then conclude there's a crisis of housing ambition when most folks don't end up in 5-bedroom estates with ocean views. The gap isn't aspirational, it's structural. Here's what the data actually shows when you look closer. People's ideal family size has remained remarkably stable across decades. 2 to 3 children. That number hasn't really moved. What's moved is the number they actually have. The desire is still there. What's changed is the feasibility. And this brings us to one of the more insidious aspects of the modern fertility discourse, the way it pathologizes women's education and career participation, as if these are lifestyle accessories rather than economic necessities. You'll hear pundits wonder aloud whether women's liberation has somehow backfired, whether the price of equality is demographic collapse, as if the choice is between gender equity and human survival, as if we need to pick one. But here's what those binary thinkers miss. The countries that rank highest in gender equality aren't experiencing the steepest declines because women are times 2 times free. They're experiencing them because the system was designed for a different era entirely, and nobody bothered to redesign it when everything changed. Iceland tops nearly every gender equality index on the planet. It also has a fertility rate of 1.7, but Icelanders aren't wringing their hands about women having too many choices. They're actually trying to make family formation times easier times while preserving equality, generous parental leave, subsidized childcare, flexible work arrangements that don't punish parents. They haven't solved it completely, but at least they're asking the right questions. Compare that to South Korea, where gender inequality remains stark, and the fertility rate has plummeted to 0.72, the lowest in the world. Women there aren't avoiding children because they have too much freedom. They're avoiding them because they've watched their mothers sacrifice everything, seen the expectation that working women must also be perfect homemakers, witnessed careers destroyed by maternity leave. They're looking at the deal on offer and saying, no thanks. The correlation isn't between gender equality and low birth rates. It's between times half finished, times gender equality and low birth rates. We've changed women's roles without changing men's. We've added career expectations for women without removing domestic expectations. We've built a world where women can technically do everything, and then we're surprised when they look at that impossible equation and decide that everything doesn't include children. And then there's the economic piece that nobody wants to say out loud. Having children has become a luxury good in developed nations. Think about what it takes to have a child in a major city today. Not the biological act, the economic foundation. You need housing with an extra bedroom. In London, that's £500,000 minimum. In San Francisco or New York, closer to $1 million. You need childcare, which in many American cities costs more than college tuition. We're talking $1,500, $2,000 a month per child. You need parental leave, which in the United States barely exists, forcing new mothers back to work within weeks of giving birth. You need healthcare that won't bankrupt you if there's a complication. You need job security, which is increasingly rare in our gig economy world of contract workers and at-will employment. Previous generations didn't face this calculation. My grandparents didn't need advanced degrees and dual 6-figure incomes to contemplate children. Housing was affordable. Single incomes supported families. Communities provided informal childcare networks. Having children was economically neutral or even beneficial. An extra pair of hands on the farm, someone to care for you in old age, a participant in the family business. Now, children are a massive economic drain with no tangible return on investment. I'm stating facts here, not making moral judgments. In purely economic terms, children cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and produce nothing. They reduce your earning potential, especially if you're a woman. They constrain your career flexibility and geographic mobility. They consume resources that could be invested in assets that appreciate real estate, stocks, retirement funds. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We've organized our entire society around the assumption that people will continue having children anyway, out of some biological imperative or emotional need that overrides economic rationality. We've made parenthood financially punishing and then acted shocked when educated people who've been trained their entire lives to make rational cost-benefit analyses, look at the numbers and opt out. The fertility crisis isn't a mystery. It's not some inexplicable cultural shift or values decay. It's rational actors responding rationally to the incentive structure we've created. We've made children expensive, raised the standards for acceptable parenting to impossible heights, removed community support systems, required dual incomes for middle-class life, and then we clutch our pearls when birth rates drop. And here's where it gets even more twisted. We're now being told that declining birth rates are a times crisis, times that threaten civilization itself. Politicians wring their hands about pension systems collapsing and economies stagnating. They warn about demographic winters and the end of our way of life. But notice what they're times not times doing. They're not making it easier to have kids. They're not providing universal childcare, or guaranteeing parental leave, or making housing affordable, or reducing the credential arms race. Instead, they're giving speeches. They're launching campaigns, encouraging people to have more babies. They're offering tiny tax credits that don't even cover a month of daycare. It's like watching someone set a building on fire and then scolding people for not wanting to live in it. Why won't you go inside? Don't you care about the community? This building is essential to our neighborhood. The countries that have actually moved the needle on birth rates didn't do it with rhetoric or appeals to duty. They did it by changing the underlying economics. Universal childcare, generous parental leave for both parents, child allowances that actually matter, housing policies that don't treat homes purely as investment vehicles, flexible work arrangements that treat parents like human beings rather than productivity units with inconvenient biological needs. But in most of the developed world, we're not doing those things because those things cost money. They require redistribution. They threaten established interests. So instead, we get think pieces about selfishness and social media campaigns about the joys of parenthood and op-eds lamenting the decline of family values. Meanwhile, the actual humans living in this system look around, do the math, and make the entirely sensible decision that they can't afford it. Not just financially, though that's huge, but emotionally, physically, career-wise. The cost-benefit analysis doesn't work anymore, and no amount of Instagram posts showing picture-perfect family moments is going to change that calculation. Because here's what people don't talk about. Having kids used to be a community project. You had extended family living nearby. You had neighbors who'd been on the same street for 20 years. You had aunts and grandmothers and cousins who'd stop by unannounced and give you a break. The village actually existed. Now, you're lucky if your parents live in the same state. Extended family is scattered across time zones. Your friends are all as exhausted and time-starved as you are. And hiring help? That's another luxury item most people can't afford. So you're doing this essentially solo, or as a duo if you have a partner, trying to replicate what used to take an entire support network. I've watched friends go from vibrant, interesting people with hobbies and dreams to exhausted zombies who can barely string together a conversation that doesn't involve sleep schedules or pediatrician appointments. And before anyone jumps down my throat, yes, They love their kids. But love doesn't refill your energy reserves. Love doesn't give you back the person you used to be. There's this expectation that you're supposed to sacrifice everything and be grateful for the opportunity. Your body, your career momentum, your financial stability, your relationship, your mental health, your identity. Put it all on the altar of parenthood and smile while you're doing it. And if you dare to express any ambivalence, any hesitation, any doubt, you're selfish, you're immature, you'll regret it. But here's the thing, regret goes both ways. We talk constantly about the regret of not having kids. There are entire think pieces dedicated to it. But the regret of having them, that's the third rail nobody wants to touch. Yet it exists. There are parents who love their children and still wish they hadn't had them. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's truth nonetheless. And perhaps the most difficult part of this regret is how invisible it must remain, how utterly unspeakable it is in almost every context where parents gather. Because what happens when a parent even hints at this feeling? The judgment is swift, the condemnation, immediate. They're called selfish, ungrateful, told they don't deserve their children, reminded that some people can't have kids, as if their regret somehow makes infertility worse, as if pain can be negated by someone else's different pain. So the regret goes underground. It becomes the thing you can never say at the playground, never admit at the pediatrician's office, never confess at family gatherings. It lives in anonymous internet forums, in late-night Google searches phrased carefully so they don't show up in your browsing history, in therapy sessions behind closed doors. And the isolation of that silence compounds the suffering. Because when you can't speak a truth, when you can't acknowledge what you're experiencing, it doesn't disappear. It just grows heavier, more toxic. You start to believe you're the only one, the singular monster in a world of loving, fulfilled parents. But you're not alone. The research, limited as it is, suggests that parental regret is far more common than we admit. One study in Israel found that approximately 8% of parents acknowledged regretting parenthood. 8%. That might sound small until you remember how taboo this admission is, how much courage it takes to say it, even in an anonymous survey. The actual number is almost certainly higher. And this isn't just about parents who had children in difficult circumstances. It's not only teen parents, or people who were pressured into it, or those facing extreme hardship. Parental regret cuts across all demographics. Married couples who planned their pregnancies, people with comfortable incomes and supportive families, parents who, by every external measure, seem to have everything they need. Because regret isn't always about circumstances. Sometimes it's about fit, about the fundamental mismatch between who you are and what parenthood requires. And no amount of financial security or social support can fix that. There's a particular kind of grief in this realization, the grief of watching other people inhabit a role that feels utterly foreign to you. You see parents at the playground, seemingly content, and you wonder, what do they have that I don't? What switch flipped in them that remained stubbornly off in you? But here's what I've learned. It's not a switch. It's not a deficiency. It's just difference. Some people are wired for the relentless immediacy of parenthood. They thrive in the chaos, find meaning in the repetition, feel fulfilled by the complete subsumption of self that infants require. Their identity expands to accommodate this new role, like water filling a container. Others, and there's no moral judgment here, simply aren't. Their sense of self is less elastic, or perhaps more fiercely defended. They need quiet to think, solitude to recharge, autonomy to feel human. They require a degree of control over their environment that small children, by their very nature, obliterate. Neither is better, neither is worse. They're just different configurations of a human personality. But we don't talk about it that way, do we? We talk about parenthood as if it's the universal human experience, as if everyone is secretly designed for it, as if those who struggle are simply not trying hard enough or not loving deeply enough. What a cruel fiction that is. Because love, in this context, often becomes the problem rather than the solution. You love your child. Of course you do. That's what makes it so agonizing. If you didn't love them, you could simply detach, go through the motions with emotional distance. But you can't. You're trapped in this terrible paradox, loving someone intensely while simultaneously feeling destroyed by the role of caring for them. It's like being allergic to your own child, not to them as a person, but to the fundamental restructuring of existence that they represent. And here's what makes it even more complicated. Society tells you that this restructuring should feel like fulfillment. You're constantly bombarded with messages that parenthood completes you, that it gives your life meaning, that it's the most rewarding thing you'll ever do. And when your actual experience doesn't match that narrative, you start to think something is fundamentally broken inside you. You see other parents posting photos of messy kitchens with captions like chaos, but wouldn't change it for the world. And you think, really? You wouldn't? Because I absolutely would. I would change this. I would go back and make a different choice if I could. And then immediately, you feel like a monster for even thinking that. The guilt becomes this constant background radiation. It's there when you're playing with your child and suddenly realize you've been mentally checked out for the past 10 minutes, just going through the motions. It's there when you feel a surge of resentment because they interrupted you again. It's there when you fantasize about your old life, not even doing anything exciting, just sitting in a coffee shop alone, reading a book, with no one needing anything from you. And you can't talk about these feelings honestly without someone immediately saying, "But you love your child, right?" As if that question erases everything else. As if love is supposed to be some magical antidote that neutralizes all the suffering, all the loss, all the identity dissolution you're experiencing. Yes, you love your child. That was never in question. But love doesn't make you need less sleep. Love doesn't restore the person you used to be. Love doesn't give you back your autonomy, your time, your mental space, your partnership, your career momentum, your body, your freedom. Love, in fact, makes it worse. Because if you didn't love them, you could perhaps find some emotional distance. You could detach. But you do love them intensely, and that love binds you even more tightly to a role that's destroying the person you were. And sometimes, late at night, you wonder if they know, if somewhere beneath the dementia, beneath the confusion and the fear and the anger, they understand what's happening to you. If they see the exhaustion in your eyes, the way your hands shake when you're trying to be patient, the forced brightness in your voice when you're explaining something for the 20th time that day. You wonder if some part of them, the part that raised you, that knew you better than anyone, recognizes that they're watching you disappear. There are moments that suggest they might. Fleeting instances where something shifts in their expression, where they look at you with sudden clarity and say, "You should go home now. You look tired." Or they touch your face gently, the way they used to when you were small and upset, and for just a second, you see them again, really them. And those moments are both gift and curse, because they remind you of everything that's being lost on both sides of this equation. The isolation deepens in ways you couldn't have predicted. Your married friends stop inviting you to things because you always have to cancel. Your single friends can't relate to what you're going through. They're still navigating dating apps and career moves, while you're researching adult diaper brands and arguing with insurance companies. You exist in a strange liminal space, not quite the person you were, not quite knowing who you're becoming. You develop a kind of social anxiety around normal conversations. When someone asks how you are, you freeze. Do they really want to know? Should you tell them about the 3-hour meltdown over breakfast, or the fact that you haven't had a full night's sleep in 6 months? Or should you just smile and say fine and ask about their weekend? You become skilled at deflection, at keeping conversations surface level, because the truth of your life feels too heavy to drop into casual small talk. You start editing your own stories in real time. When someone asks how your day was, you do this mental calculation. What version of the truth can I tell that won't make them uncomfortable, that won't make me the difficult one, that won't require them to actually help? You learn to package your struggles into palatable anecdotes, little self-deprecating jokes that diffuse the tension before it builds. Oh, just living the dream. You say with a laugh that sounds almost real. Parenthood is wild. And they laugh too, relieved that you're keeping it light, grateful they don't have to witness the actual weight you're carrying. But here's what happens in that constant self-editing. You start to lose track of what's real. When you're always performing a more manageable version of your life, always smoothing out the rough edges before you speak them aloud, you begin to feel like you're living at a distance from your own experience. Your actual feelings, the frustration, the bone-deep exhaustion, the occasional flashes of resentment, they start to feel like secrets you're keeping even from yourself. Because if you can't say them out loud, if there's no witness to them, do they even count? Or are you just supposed to quietly absorb them, metabolize them into something more socially acceptable? This is the loneliness within loneliness. It's not just that you're alone with the work, it's that you're alone with the truth of what the work actually feels like. You're surrounded by people who see you, who interact with you, who ask you questions, but nobody's really asking the questions that would crack you open. Nobody's saying, "No, really, how are you holding up under all of this?" Nobody's giving you permission to stop pretending that you've got it more together than you do. And maybe that's because we've all collectively agreed to this performance. We've all silently decided that acknowledging how hard this actually is would be too destabilizing, too threatening to the entire structure we're all propping up. So we perform. We put on the mask every single morning. We rehearse our lines in the shower. We walk into the office or log into the meeting and we say good morning in that specific tone that signals everything is normal, everything is fine, everything is under control. And maybe that's the most exhausting part of it all, not the actual work itself, but the constant performance of being someone who isn't drowning. You develop these little rituals, these tiny acts of theatre. You learn to laugh at the right moments during meetings, even when nothing is funny. You learn to nod thoughtfully when someone's talking, even when you stopped processing their words 3 sentences ago because your brain is too full of everything else you're supposed to be remembering. You learn to say, "Let me circle back on that," when what you really mean is, "I have absolutely no capacity to think about that right now, and I'm barely keeping track of what day it is." And the thing is, everyone else is doing it too. You can see it if you look closely enough. That slight delay before someone responds in a video call that's not lag, that's them remembering which version of themselves they're supposed to be right now. That forced enthusiasm in the team chat that's not genuine energy, that's someone who's read the room and knows that anything less than exclamation points will be read as negativity or lack of commitment. We've created this bizarre ecosystem where everyone is performing wellness for everyone else, and we're all too tired from the performance to acknowledge that it's a performance at all. It's like we're all actors in a play, but nobody gave us the script, so we're just improvising based on what we think everyone else expects, and everyone else is doing the exact same thing. So we're all just mirroring each other's anxiety back and forth in an endless loop of manufactured normalcy. And you start to wonder, when did it become radical to just admit you're tired? When did it become a career risk to say, "I don't have the bandwidth for that right now," without immediately following it up with a plan for how you'll make the bandwidth appear out of thin air? When did we all agree that treating human beings like infinitely expandable resources was just the cost of doing business? Somewhere along the way, we stopped distinguishing between dedication and self-destruction. We started celebrating people who work through weekends, who never take their vacation days, who answer emails at midnight, not because they're passionate, but because we've collectively lost the script on what healthy commitment actually looks like. And the thing is, you can see it in the language we use. We don't say, "I worked late." We say, "I crushed it today." like the goal is pulverization rather than accomplishment. We don't say, I'm struggling with workload. We say, I'm not being efficient enough, like the problem is us, not the fact that one person is doing what used to be 3 people's jobs. There's this quiet erosion that happens when you're always in that state. You stop noticing the things you used to love. That hobby you had, when's the last time you actually did it? Not just thought about how nice it would be if you had time. Those friends you keep meaning to call back, how many times have you mentally drafted the text explaining why you've been MIA, only to realize you're too exhausted to even send the apology? You become a curator of intentions instead of a person who actually does things. Your life becomes this museum of someday I'll take that trip. Someday I'll learn that skill. Someday I'll actually be present instead of just physically there while my mind runs through tomorrow's task list. And maybe the worst part is how normalized it's become to treat burnout like a badge of honor. How we've built entire industries around helping people cope with being overworked instead of addressing why they're overworked in the first place. Meditation apps to calm your anxiety about impossible deadlines. Sleep podcasts to help you shut down a brain that never stops spinning. Productivity hacks to help you squeeze more output from a nervous system that's already running on fumes. We've turned self-care into another job, something else you have to optimize, schedule, and feel guilty about not doing well enough. And here's the cruelest irony of all: the more anxious we become, the more we consume. The wellness industry knows this. The self-help market knows this. They're not trying to cure your anxiety. They're trying to monetize it. Because an anxious person is a perfect consumer, you're always looking for the next thing that might finally make you feel okay. The next supplement, the next morning routine, the next gratitude journal, with just the right kind of paper that might somehow transform your racing thoughts into peaceful acceptance. I spent years doing this, buying books I never read, about becoming the person I thought I needed to be, downloading apps that promised to fix my sleep, my focus, my entire emotional landscape. Each purchase felt like hope, like maybe this would be the thing that finally worked. But it never was, because the problem wasn't that I hadn't found the right product. The problem was that I was treating my humanity like a glitch that needed debugging. We've forgotten that anxiety isn't always pathology. Sometimes it's information. Sometimes your body is trying to tell you something important, that you're doing too much, that you're ignoring your actual needs, that the life you're living doesn't match the life you actually want. But we've been taught to silence that voice immediately, to manage it, medicate it, meditate it away, to treat every uncomfortable feeling as an emergency that needs to be fixed right now. What if we didn't? What if we actually listened? I'm not suggesting we romanticize mental illness or pretend that clinical anxiety doesn't require real treatment. It absolutely does. But I am suggesting that maybe not every anxious feeling is a disorder. Maybe some of it is a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. Maybe your anxiety about money isn't because you're broken, it's because rent costs 70% of your income and one medical emergency could destroy you financially. Maybe your social anxiety isn't a character flaw, it's because we've built a world where every interaction is performed and recorded and potentially viral. Maybe you're not too sensitive. Maybe the world has become unbearably overstimulating, and your nervous system is just telling the truth. We've pathologized normal human responses to abnormal conditions. We've turned survival mechanisms into symptoms. We've convinced people that their entirely rational reactions to an irrational world mean something is broken inside them. You know what's actually broken. The expectation that you should be productive every single day. The assumption that you should always be reachable. The idea that rest is something you have to earn rather than something your body fundamentally requires. Your great-grandparents didn't need productivity apps. They worked hard, sure, but when the sun went down, work ended. There was no email, no Slack, no text from your boss at 9 p.m. asking if you saw their message. The boundary between work and life wasn't something you had to fight for. It just existed. Now we're told to set boundaries as if the problem is our failure to assert them, rather than a system designed to demolish them. We're given mindfulness apps by the same companies whose business model is attention extraction. We're sold weighted blankets and sleep supplements to fix the insomnia caused by staring at blue light until midnight, because we're still catching up on the work we didn't finish during our 8 distraction-filled hours at the office. The therapeutic industrial complex will offer you 1,000 coping mechanisms before it questions the thing you're being asked to cope with. And don't get me wrong, therapy can be life-changing. Medication can be necessary. Coping skills matter. But somewhere along the way, we stopped asking, what if the problem isn't us? What if we're not broken? What if this simply isn't how humans were meant to live? Because here's the thing they don't tell you in those employee wellness seminars. You are not a machine that occasionally needs maintenance. You're a biological organism with needs that cannot be optimized away. Your body doesn't speak the language of quarterly projections and deliverables. It speaks in hunger and fatigue, in the tension that builds between your shoulder blades, in the headache that blooms behind your eyes at 3 p.m. every single day. It speaks in the way your heart races when you see your manager's name in your inbox, in the way your stomach drops when Sunday evening arrives and the weight of Monday morning presses down on you like a physical thing. And we've been taught to ignore these signals, to override them, to push through. We call it resilience. We call it work ethic. We call it adulting. But your body calls it something else entirely: threat. Because when you're chronically stressed, when you're running on 5 hours of sleep and too much coffee, when you haven't moved from your desk in 4 hours, when you're eating lunch hunched over your keyboard while answering emails, your body doesn't know you're just trying to meet a deadline. It doesn't understand the concept of a fiscal year or a performance review. All it knows is that you're in danger, that resources are scarce, that rest is impossible, that you must remain vigilant. So it floods your system with cortisol. It keeps your nervous system on high alert. It prepares you for a threat that never comes, or rather, that never leaves. This is the state we've normalized. This is what we call a career. And then we wonder why anxiety disorders are at an all-time high, why burnout is now recognized as an official medical diagnosis by the World Health Organization, why antidepressant use has skyrocketed, why people in their 30s are having heart attacks, why life expectancy in some developed nations is actually declining. We keep looking for individual solutions to what is fundamentally a structural problem. We download meditation apps while working 60-hour weeks. We do yoga on Sunday to recover from the stress of a job that will resume Monday morning. We see therapists who help us develop coping mechanisms for conditions that shouldn't require coping in the first place. And don't get me wrong, these things can help. Meditation is valuable, therapy is important, exercise matters. But here's what nobody wants to say out loud. You cannot self-care your way out of a system designed to extract maximum value from your existence, while giving you minimum support in return. You can journal all you want. You can practice gratitude until you're blue in the face. You can buy the fancy planner, light the candle, take the bath. And look, those things might help you survive another day. They might give you an hour of peace in a week of chaos. But they're not going to change the fact that your rent went up again. They're not going to make your employer pay you what you're worth. They're not going to give you back the time you lose commuting or the energy you spend navigating systems that were designed to be confusing on purpose. The wellness industry has convinced us that if we're stressed, anxious, or depressed, the problem is our individual failure to properly manage our mental health. Not enough yoga, not enough meditation, not enough positive thinking. As if the correct combination of self-help books and breathing exercises will somehow neutralize the effects of living in a society that treats human beings as disposable resources. And here's the insidious part. By framing mental health as purely personal responsibility, we stop asking the harder questions. We stop looking at why so many people are struggling with the exact same problems at the exact same time. We stop noticing patterns. When one person in an office is burned out, we say that person needs to work on their stress management. When the entire office is burned out, maybe we should be looking at the office. But that conversation is dangerous. That conversation threatens profits. So instead, we get corporate-sponsored mindfulness sessions. We get mental health awareness months where companies tweet supportive messages while offering no additional sick days, no mental health coverage, no reduction in impossible workloads. We get told to be resilient, as if resilience is supposed to be an infinite resource that never runs out no matter how much weight keeps getting added. I'm not saying self-care is worthless. I'm saying it's insufficient. I'm saying we've been sold a solution that deliberately ignores the actual problem. It's like telling someone whose house is on fire that they should really focus on their breathing techniques. Sure, staying calm might help, but maybe someone should also address the fire. The fire is still burning, and we're running out of breath. Because here's what nobody tells you about the attention economy. It doesn't just want your focus. It wants your time's exhaustion asterisk. It profits from the moment when you're too tired to think critically, too drained to resist, too overwhelmed to do anything but scroll. The advertising industry figured this out decades ago. There's a reason commercials air late at night when your defenses are down. There's a reason email marketing intensifies on Friday afternoons when you're mentally checked out. There's a reason that one more episode button appears exactly when your willpower is depleted. Tired people make impulsive decisions. Exhausted people buy things they don't need. Overwhelmed people click on headlines they'd normally ignore. The attention economy doesn't want you well-rested and clear-headed. It wants you just conscious enough to keep consuming. And the platforms know this. They've studied it. They've optimized for it. YouTube's algorithm doesn't just recommend videos you might like, it recommends videos that will keep you watching when you're too tired to stop. Netflix doesn't autoplay the next episode because they think you're eager for more. They autoplay it because they know you're too exhausted to reach for the remote. Instagram doesn't infinite scroll because it's convenient. It infinite scrolls because eliminating stopping points eliminates decision-making, and eliminating decision-making means you stay longer, especially when you're already depleted. The entire infrastructure is built around exploiting your lowest energy states, your worst moments, your weakest hours. And we're all just participating, night after night, scroll after scroll, click after click. You know what's really disturbing? Sleep deprivation is considered torture under international law. It's literally a method of breaking down prisoners. But we're doing it to ourselves voluntarily, for entertainment, for content, for the sake of staying connected. We're torturing ourselves with distraction and then wondering why we can't think straight. The World Health Organization has declared insufficient sleep a public health epidemic. Not in some distant future right now, today. And one of the leading causes? Screen time before bed. The blue light that suppresses melatonin, the stimulating content that activates our stress responses, the endless scroll that convinces our brains it's still daytime, still hunting, still in danger. We're biologically confused, and it's killing us slowly. Our ancestors had a natural rhythm. When the sun set, activity wound down. The tribe gathered around the fire, not for stimulation, but for connection and safety. Stories were told softly. The day's events were processed. And then, as the fire died down, sleep came naturally because the body knew deeply, instinctively knew that darkness meant rest. We've broken that ancient contract. We've flooded our nights with artificial day, and now we wonder why we can't shut down, why our minds race at 2 a.m., why we wake up exhausted after 8 hours in bed. It's not a personal failing. It's a biological rebellion against an environment that no longer makes sense to the primitive systems running beneath our conscious awareness. And here's what really keeps me up at night, pun intended. We're not just sleep-depriving ourselves as individuals, we're doing it to our children. We're raising a generation that has never known true darkness, never experienced the natural wind-down that comes when screens turn off and artificial light fades. We put tablets in their hands at age 2, and then express concern when they can't settle at bedtime. We schedule their lives so tightly that rest becomes another item on the to-do list, squeezed between homework and extracurriculars. I've watched teenagers walk into school looking like zombies, clutching energy drinks just to make it through first period. And we tell them it's normal, growing pains, part of being young. But it's not normal. It's a catastrophe playing out in slow motion, damaging developing brains that won't finish maturing for another decade. The research on adolescent sleep is particularly heartbreaking. Teenage brains naturally shift toward later sleep times. It's called delayed sleep phase, and it's completely biological. They're not being difficult when they can't fall asleep at 10 p.m. Their melatonin literally doesn't start releasing until later. But we've built a school system that forces them awake at 6 a.m., fighting against millions of years of biological programming. And then we're surprised when they struggle academically, emotionally, mentally. And here's what makes it even more tragic. We have the research. We know what happens when schools start later. When Minneapolis pushed high school start times to 8:40 a.m., car crash rates among teen drivers dropped by 70%. 70%. We're literally letting teenagers die to preserve a schedule that doesn't serve them. Academic performance improves. Attendance goes up. Depression rates decline. We have mountains of evidence showing that aligning school schedules with adolescent sleep biology creates better outcomes across every metric we care about. But we don't change. Because it's inconvenient. Because it would mess with bus schedules and sports practice times and parents' work routines. We prioritize logistics over biology, and the kids pay the price. You see this dynamic everywhere once you start looking for it. We've created systems that directly contradict what we know about human sleep, and then we pathologize the people who can't adapt to those systems. Take shift work. We know that working nights or rotating shifts devastates sleep architecture. Your body never fully adjusts to sleeping during the day because light still signals daytime to your brain. Studies show shift workers have higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, and certain cancers. The World Health Organization has classified overnight shift work as a probable carcinogen, and yet millions of people do it because our economy demands 24/7 availability, because hospitals and factories and call centers need to operate around the clock. So we ask human beings to override their circadian biology, and then we frame their resulting health problems as personal failures rather than systemic consequences. The night shift worker who develops metabolic syndrome isn't suffering from poor self-care. They're suffering from being forced to live against the fundamental rhythm that governs every cell in their body. Or consider the cultural glorification of busyness, of hustling, of grinding. We wear sleep deprivation like a badge of honor. 4 hours of sleep becomes a flex, proof of dedication, commitment, work ethic. Celebrities and entrepreneurs brag about how little they sleep, as if exhaustion were a mark of success rather than a red flag. And people internalize this. They feel guilty for needing 8 hours. They see sleep as laziness, as wasted time, as something weak people indulge in while the strong push through. But here's what they don't tell you in those motivational posts. Here's what gets conveniently left out of the hustle mythology. Every single one of those sleep-deprived success stories, they crashed. Hard. Elon Musk himself has admitted that his 120-hour work weeks were, quote, not good for his health. He's talked about needing Ambien to shut his brain down. Thomas Edison, despite his 4-hour sleep claims, was famous for taking multiple naps throughout the day. He just didn't count those as sleep. And Margaret Thatcher? She actually slept more than 4 hours. That was propaganda. Her own staff confirmed she regularly got 6 to 7 hours. She just liked the image of the Iron Lady who didn't need rest. The mythology was strategic. The reality was human. And the CEOs and executives who brag about their 4 a.m. wake-up calls, look closer. They're not bragging about going to bed at 1 a.m. They're going to bed at 8 or 9 p.m. They're still getting their 7 to 8 hours. They've just shifted the timing to fit a narrative that sounds more impressive. Because waking up at 4 a.m. sounds disciplined and hardcore. Going to bed at 8 p.m. sounds like you're in elementary school. But the math is the same, the sleep is the same, only the marketing changes. We've built an entire culture on a foundation of lies about sleep. We've turned a biological necessity into a moral failing. We've made rest shameful and exhaustion a badge of honor. And the result? We're all walking around like zombies, pretending to be productive while our brains slowly deteriorate. We're sacrificing our health, our relationships, our actual performance on the altar of looking busy. Because here's the cruel irony. Sleep deprivation doesn't actually make you more productive. It makes you less. You spend more hours working, sure, but you accomplish less in those hours. Your focus is shot. Your creativity is gone. Your decision-making is impaired. Studies show that after 17 hours without sleep, your cognitive performance is equivalent to having a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. That's legally drunk in many places. After 24 hours, you're at 0.1%, completely impaired. You wouldn't brag about coming to work drunk, but we brag about coming to work exhausted, which has the same effect on our brains. We've built an entire culture around the glorification of exhaustion, the late-night work sessions, the "I'll sleep when I'm dead" mentality, the humble brags about how little rest we're getting by on. We wear our fatigue like a badge of honor, proof that we're working harder than everyone else, sacrificing more, caring more about success. But here's what that badge actually represents: impaired judgment, decreased emotional regulation, slower reaction times, reduced creativity, compromised decision-making. Everything that actually makes us good at our jobs, diminished. And we do this to ourselves voluntarily, every single night. The irony is brutal. We sacrifice sleep to be more productive, but the sleep deprivation makes us significantly less productive. We stay up late to get more done, but our sleep-deprived brains work so inefficiently that we would have accomplished more in less time if we'd just gone to bed. We're running on a treadmill, exhausting ourselves while going nowhere. The research on this is overwhelming. One study followed workers across multiple industries and found that after 17 to 19 hours without sleep, performance was equivalent to having a blood alcohol content of 0.05%. After 24 hours without sleep, that climbs to 0.1%, legally drunk in most countries. Think about what that means for your average person who wakes up at 6 in the morning and stays up until midnight. By the time evening arrives, by the time you're making decisions about what to eat, how to interact with your family, whether to send that email, your brain is operating at the level of someone who's had several drinks. And we make major life decisions in this state: financial choices, relationship conversations, parenting decisions, career moves, all while cognitively impaired, all while telling ourselves we're fine, we're just tired, it's no big deal. And the worst part? We don't even realize we're compromised. There's no dashboard in your skull that lights up saying, "Warning, cognitive function at 62%. You just feel normal, slightly off maybe, but normal enough. This is what makes chronic sleep deprivation so insidious. When you're drunk, you know you're drunk. The room spins. Your words slur. There's feedback. But when you're sleep deprived, you feel competent. You feel like yourself. Just a slightly slower, slightly foggier version. And here's where it gets truly dangerous. The worse your sleep debt becomes, the worse you become at assessing your own impairment. It's called metacognitive failure. Your ability to evaluate your own performance deteriorates along with your actual performance. You think you're doing fine. You genuinely believe you're functioning normally. Meanwhile, objective measures show you're making mistakes at triple your normal rate. This is why sleep-deprived doctors don't realize they're misdiagnosing patients. Why exhausted drivers genuinely believe they're alert enough to make that drive. Why you think you wrote a perfectly clear email when what you actually sent was a confusing mess that offended 3 people and made no sense to anyone. You're flying blind, and you don't even know you can't see. I saw this firsthand during my residency. There was this attending physician, brilliant guy, who prided himself on working longer hours than anyone else. 4 hours of sleep a night for years. He'd brag about it, actually. Treated it like a badge of honor. And he genuinely believed he was performing at peak level. He'd tell residents, "You don't need more sleep. You need more discipline." Then, one day, he made a medication error. Nothing fatal, thankfully, but significant. When it was reviewed, they went back through his recent cases and found dozens of small mistakes, subtle things, a delayed diagnosis here, a slightly wrong dosage there, a misread test result. He was shocked. Absolutely shocked. He'd had no idea. None. He'd felt fine. Sharp, even. That's the metacognitive trap. Your reality and actual reality diverge, and you have no way of knowing. Which brings us to the most terrifying question of all. If we can't trust our perception of our own mental state, what can we trust? And the answer psychology gives us is uncomfortable. We can trust patterns over time. We can trust external feedback from people who know us well. We can trust behavioral data more than subjective feeling. There's a concept in therapy called opposite action. It's used primarily in dialectical behavior therapy, and it's exactly what it sounds like. When your emotions are telling you to do one thing, you deliberately do the opposite. Feeling depressed and want to stay in bed? Get up and go outside. Feeling anxious about a social event and want to cancel? Go anyway. Feeling angry and want to lash out? Respond with gentleness. It sounds simplistic. It sounds like toxic positivity repackaged. But here's why it works. Your emotions, especially when you're struggling, are often giving you terrible advice. They're trying to protect you using outdated threat assessments. Your depression says, conserve energy, stay safe, don't risk rejection, because that's what worked when you were a vulnerable child. But you're not anymore. Opposite action isn't about invalidating your feelings. It's about recognizing that feelings are information, not instructions. They're data points, not commands. And this is where we come full circle to awareness. Because to practice opposite action, you first need to notice what your emotions are telling you to do. You need that metacognitive step. You need to see the impulse before you act on it. This is the real work of mental health. Not feeling better necessarily, but developing the capacity to observe yourself with curiosity instead of judgment, to notice patterns, to question the narrative your brain is spinning, because your brain is always spinning a narrative. Always. It can't help itself. That's what brains do. They take disconnected sensory input and weave it into a coherent story. And when information is missing, they fill in the gaps, usually without telling you they're doing it. There's a phenomenon called confabulation. It's most dramatic in certain neurological conditions, but we all do it to some degree. We literally make up explanations for our own behavior, then believe those explanations completely. Split brain patients are the most striking example. When the connection between their brain hemispheres is severed, researchers can show an image to only one hemisphere. That hemisphere might prompt an action, like standing up. When asked why they stood up, the other hemisphere, which didn't see the image, immediately invents a reason. I wanted to get a drink, and they believe it absolutely. The rational mind doesn't say, I don't know. It fills in the gap. It creates a story that makes sense. And this happens constantly, in all of us, every single day. You reach for your phone without thinking. A moment later, if someone asks why, you'll say you needed to check the time or see if someone messaged you. But the truth? The impulse came first. The explanation came after. We are storytelling creatures living under the illusion that we're logical ones. And nowhere is this more obvious than in how we make decisions. There's a famous study where people were asked to choose between pairs of identical items, socks, stockings, articles of clothing. They were laid out in a row, and participants consistently chose items on the right side. When asked why, not a single person said, because it was on the right. Instead, they invented reasons. This one felt softer. The color was richer. The quality seemed better. They confabulated. They created meaning where there was only position. Our rational mind is like a press secretary for a government it doesn't control. It gets the decision after it's been made and has to explain it to the public. And it's very, very good at its job. This is why self-awareness is so difficult. This is why people can be so confident in reasons that aren't true. You ask someone why they fell in love, and they'll give you a list. Kindness, humor, intelligence, shared interests. But if you introduce them to someone else with all those qualities, they won't fall in love. Because the real reasons are hidden, non-verbal, subconscious, written in pheromones, in micro-expressions, in the mysterious calculus of attraction that never speaks in words. The rational explanation is a translation of something that was never written in language to begin with. And this creates a strange loop in human experience. We believe our reasons, we live by our stories, and those stories shape who we become. If you tell yourself you stood up because you wanted a drink, you might actually get one. The false reason becomes a real action. The story becomes the truth. This is the strange loop of consciousness. The mind narrating itself, the self creating itself through story, moment by moment. We don't just remember who we are, we continuously rewrite ourselves into existence. And this raises an uncomfortable question. If the narrator is always interpreting, always filling in gaps, always constructing meaning after the fact, then who is actually in control? The traditional view is that there's a you at the center, a unified self making decisions, choosing actions, directing the show. But the split brain research suggests something more fragmented. Something more like a committee arguing in the dark, with the press secretary out front spinning whatever story makes sense. You feel like a unity because the story feels unified. But underneath, there might be competing impulses, parallel processes, multiple voices that never quite make it into the narrative. The you that you experience is the edited version, the final cut, not the raw footage. Think about moments of indecision. You're standing in front of the fridge, hand hovering between the leftover pizza and the salad. Part of you wants the pizza. Part of you thinks you should eat the salad. You feel the tension, the pull in two directions. Eventually, you choose one, and immediately, the narrator provides a reason. I deserve a treat after today, or I've been good, I should keep it up. But what actually made the choice? Was it really the conscious you, weighing options rationally? Or was it a cascade of unconscious factors, blood sugar, stress levels, which option your hand was closer to, some random neural fluctuation, and the narrator simply claimed credit afterward? Benjamin Libet's experiment suggested something unsettling. He asked people to note the exact moment they decided to move their finger. Meanwhile, he measured their brain activity. The result? The brain showed signs of preparing the movement several hundred milliseconds before the person reported deciding to move. The action was already in motion before consciousness caught up. The narrator arrived late to the scene and said, "Yes, this was my decision." This finding troubled philosophers and neuroscientists alike. If our decisions are made before we're aware of them, what does that say about free will? What does it mean to choose? But here's where the story gets more interesting. Follow-up studies revealed something the initial interpretation missed. While the brain does begin preparing movement before conscious awareness, there's a window, a brief but crucial moment, where conscious will can veto the action. You can stop the hand from moving. You can cancel the command. Free will, in this model, becomes less about originating action and more about executive control. Less about creation, more about editing. You don't write the first draft of your impulses, but you can revise before publishing. Think of it like this. Your brain generates suggestions constantly, bubbling up possibilities, urges, ideas. Most never reach consciousness. They're filtered out, deemed irrelevant or inappropriate by systems you never consult. But some break through to awareness, and when they do, you, the conscious self, get to weigh in. Not on whether the impulse arises, but on whether it proceeds. This is a different kind of freedom than we imagined. Not the freedom of an unmoved mover, standing outside causation, conjuring decisions from pure will, but the freedom of a conductor who doesn't compose the instruments but shapes how they play together. The freedom of a gardener who doesn't create seeds but decides what grows and what gets pulled. And maybe that's enough. Maybe freedom was never about being the ultimate source, uncaused and sovereign. Maybe it's about being a meaningful participant in the process, a link in the causal chain that actually matters, that bends the arc of events in ways that reflect values, intentions, care. Maybe you don't need to be the unmoved mover to be genuinely free. Maybe you just need to be moved in the right way by reasons rather than blind impulses, by reflective consideration rather than mechanical reaction, by the kind of complex internal dialogue that turns mere causation into deliberation. There's something poetic about that, isn't there? The idea that freedom emerges not from escaping causation, but from being caused by the right kinds of things. That when your decisions flow from your considered values, from careful thought, from who you've become through lived experience, that's freedom enough. Even if those values were themselves shaped by prior causes. Even if your capacity for careful thought developed through circumstances you didn't choose. The alternative, the libertarian picture where you're somehow outside the causal order, making choices from nowhere, starts to look not like freedom but like randomness. If your decisions aren't connected to your character, your reasons, your past, then in what sense are they yours? They'd be arbitrary eruptions, uncaused events that just happen to occur in the vicinity of your consciousness. Real freedom might be more like authorship than magic. An author doesn't create from nothing, they work with language they inherited. Genres that existed before them, influences they didn't choose. But the novel is still genuinely theirs, shaped by their particular sensibility, their unique way of weaving available elements into something new. The book is caused by their experiences, their reading, their cultural moment, and yet it's also created, genuinely authored, bearing their distinctive mark. You're like that. Your choices emerge from prior causes, yes, but they're filtered through the irreducible complexity of your particular consciousness. They bear your signature. And maybe that's what we actually mean when we talk about free will in our clearest moments, not some impossible escape from causation, but the presence of a certain kind of causal process, the kind that runs through reflection, through selfhood, through meaning. You're not writing yourself from scratch. You're writing yourself from what's already written, but the pen is genuinely in your hand. And here's something I find oddly comforting. Even our mistakes, our regrets, the choices we wish we could unmake, they were still ours. The responsibility doesn't evaporate just because we acknowledge the complexity of causation. If anything, it becomes more textured, more real. You didn't choose in a vacuum, but you still chose. The influences that shaped you don't make you less real, they make you more particular, more you. There's a kind of grace in accepting this. Not the grace of being let off the hook, but the grace of being connected to your history, to your community, to the long chain of causes that deposited you precisely here, precisely now, with precisely these capacities and constraints. You are not separate from the universe, making choices at it from the outside. You are the universe making choices through one of its temporary patterns of organization. And that pattern, for this brief moment, is called by your name. Does that make your choices less significant? I don't think so. If anything, it makes them more precious. These decisions, this life, This particular path through possibility space, it only happens once. This exact configuration of causation, channeled through this exact self, producing these exact effects. It's unrepeatable. When you choose, something genuinely new enters the world, not uncaused, but unprecedented. The universe has been arranging itself for billions of years to produce this moment where you decide what to do next. That's not diminishment, that's consequence. And yes, you could have decided differently if the universe had been arranged differently, but it wasn't. It was arranged exactly this way, and so you chose exactly this. And now the universe is different because of it. Your choice has become part of the causal structure that will shape everything downstream. You are both effect and cause, both determined and determining. And perhaps that's the only kind of freedom anything in this universe ever gets. The philosopher Daniel Dennett used to talk about the difference between being a prisoner of your past and being an author of your future. But maybe those aren't opposites. Maybe you're always both. The past wrote the first chapters of your story, established the setting, introduced the characters, set certain plot points in motion. You didn't choose the opening pages. But now you hold the pen, even if your hand moves in patterns learned from everything that came before. And here's what I find strangely comforting about all this. It means your struggles aren't failures. When you find it hard to change, when you backslide into old patterns, when you promise yourself you'll do better tomorrow, and tomorrow comes and you don't, that's not moral weakness. That's physics. That's billions of neural connections weighted by thousands of repetitions pulling you toward established attractors in your behavioral state space. But physics also tells us that systems can reorganize, that new attractors can form, that phase transitions happen when conditions change sufficiently. Your brain is not a static object, it's a dynamic process, constantly rewiring itself through experience. Every time you make a different choice, you're slightly adjusting the probability distribution of your future choices. The change is gradual, statistical, often imperceptible day to day, but it's real. You are, in the most literal sense, creating yourself through your actions, not freely, not from scratch, not unconstrained by your history or your biology or your circumstances, but creating nonetheless. Each choice feeds back into the system that generates choices. Each moment of attention reshapes the attention system itself. And maybe this is what wisdom looks like, not the achievement of perfect freedom, not the transcendence of cause and effect, but the recognition that you are part of the causal flow, that your determined nature doesn't make you passive, that being shaped by forces doesn't mean you can't also be a force that shapes. You are a pattern that perpetuates itself by engaging with the world, a self-sustaining process that experiences itself from the inside as agency, as choice, as the feeling of steering through possibility space. And whether that feeling corresponds to some metaphysical freedom or is itself just another determined phenomenon, either way, you still have to live it.